And in a palace next to this great cathedral, the emperor and his representatives met in a formal assembly called the Imperial Diet, now known as the Diet of Worms. Here, on April 17th and 18th of 1521, Martin Luther, accompanied by his lawyer, was told that he must recant, that is, take back his unacceptable religious views. He replied that it was impossible for him to go against what his conscience told him was right. The next day, the disgusted emperor informed the gathering that he was ready to take actions against Luther for being a notorious heretic. Yet while the Diet deliberated his fate inside the palace, Luther remained a free man. It was during this time that a powerful German lord named Frederick the Wise, who was a strong supporter of Luther, arranged to have him kidnapped and taken to this castle for his protection. And while at the castle, Luther wore a disguise, and his identity was kept a closely guarded secret. During this time of hiding, Luther immediately set to work translating the Bible into German, something that had never been done before. Then, 3 weeks after Luther had disappeared from view, the Edict of Worms, seen here, was posted all across Germany. It told what should be done with the fugitive and his supporters. It commanded the emperor's subjects to crush them, to capture them, and take their properties, unless they had mended their errors and been absolved by the Pope. In Germany, the popular response to the Edict of Worms was to become a great turning point in the history of Western civilization, because most people simply chose to ignore it. And as a result, it was not long before Lutheranism was adopted as the official religion in many of the German states. In certain ways, Lutheranism was a reformulation of old Christian beliefs and practices freed from papal control. But wherever the new religion was adopted, significant political changes followed. For example, rulers who adopted Lutheranism often used it as a way to enhance their own authority at the expense of the Pope, and to keep more money for themselves instead of having to send it off to Rome. German peasants, feeling a new sense of freedom, used it as an excuse to revolt against their rulers. But in 1525, after Luther refused to support their cause because of the political chaos it was creating, 100,000 peasants died trying to improve their impoverished lives. In the 1500 years from the birth of Christ up to the lifetime of Martin Luther, only one major break had ever developed within the Christian faith. This occurred in the 5th century A.D., when Christians in Greece split from Roman control and formed the Eastern Orthodox Church. But this church never gained a foothold in Western Europe, which remained purely Catholic. In contrast, in the 16th century, after Luther started his church, many new non-Catholic Christian denominations formed in just a few decades. For example, in 1522, the theologian Ulrich Zwingli, seen here, convinced the leaders of the Swiss city of Zurich that churches should be freed from papal control, and that all religious images should be removed, because their use smacked of pagan idolatry, and that a simplified prayer service should replace the Catholic Mass. A short time later, this French theologian named John Calvin inspired an even larger number of Swiss citizens to join the Protestant movement. Calvin shared many of Luther's beliefs, but he expanded on them by preaching his grim doctrine called predestination. Predestination means that even before the time of birth, God knows whether a person will go to heaven or to hell, and that even if someone leads a life that is free from sin, they might still be doomed. This, Calvin said, was an example of the terrible majesty of God. But even in spite of this fatalistic doctrine, Each Calvinist was still expected to lead a moral life, to work hard, and to be thrifty. And by fostering these virtues, capitalism came to flourish in countries where Calvinist ideas took hold. In the Swiss city of Geneva, Calvinists formed a special police force to maintain public morality. Punishments were administered for adultery, swearing, drunkenness, wearing lavish clothing, laughing in church, and for overcharging customers. And the Calvinists continued the old Catholic tradition of burning heretics at the stake, a fate that also awaited anyone found to be practicing witchcraft. The Protestant Reformation in England happened for quite different reasons than it did in Switzerland and Germany. In England, the break with the Church occurred not for theological reasons, but because the king refused to accept a papal decision. The English king, Henry VIII, wanted a new wife, but since Catholicism forbids divorce, Henry had to ask the Pope to grant him an annulment, a decree stating that his existing marriage had never been valid. But the Pope refused, and when word of this reached the royal castle, Henry became so enraged that he decided to abolish papal authority. And in 1534, through the Act of Supremacy, he declared himself to be the supreme head of the Church in England. He divorced his wife and went on to marry 5 more times. It seems likely that Henry also severed his ties to Rome because the Church kept demanding more and more money from him, even though the Catholic monasteries already controlled 1/3 of the arable farmland in his kingdom. Henry desperately wanted control of that land, so in 1536 he decided that all English monasteries should be abolished. He ordered the monks to leave, declared that everything of value now belonged to him, had the roofs taken off the buildings, and let them fall into ruin. And by 1539, every one of England's over 500 monasteries was gone. Thus, through the dissolution of the monasteries, the king increased his wealth enormously. And by handing over some of this property to his aristocratic friends, he was able to greatly strengthen his political support throughout the kingdom. Oddly enough, unlike Luther and Calvin, Henry had no real problem with the basic teachings of the Church. He just hated being subservient to the Pope. Consequently, the services and sacraments of the Church of England differed very little from traditional Catholic practices. It was not until after King Henry's death that more radical religious changes were introduced. These included the adoption of both the Book of Common Prayer and Sacraments and of 42 articles of faith that spelled out the beliefs of the Church of England. In the buildings around this fountain, located in the northern Italian city of Trento, a great council of the Catholic Church met between the years 1545 and 1563 to try to work out a solution to the growing Protestant rebellion. The final decision reached by this council, called the Council of Trent, was that the Church would yield nothing to the religious rebels. Instead, all of the traditional teachings of the Church were upheld. The Council reaffirmed that, in addition to the Bible, the Pope and Church councils are also a valid source of religious truth. That performing good works can help win salvation, which neither Calvin nor Luther believed. That indulgences can reduce a sinner's time in purgatory. That there are 7 holy sacraments, not just the 2 recognized by Luther. That marriage cannot be dissolved, and that men who take the vows of priests must never marry. The Council also acted decisively to reform abuses within the Church hierarchy, to reinstate a more active religious role for bishops, and to increase the educational functions of the Church, as well as its role in caring for the sick and poor. War was declared against all Protestant doctrines. The Catholic Church decided to use the full force of its ancient mystical tradition against the Protestant rebels. The contrast was great, for at the very same time the Pope's lavish new church, St. Peter's Basilica, was going up in Rome, Calvinists to the north were worshiping in barren, austere spaces, having destroyed all the religious statues and stained glass they once contained. And by the end of the 1500s, such antagonism had developed between Catholics and Protestants that early in the next century it would erupt into 30 years of full-blown warfare.